Chapter 4. It happened like this. The Grand Rivera is no combat vessel, so it skips across the Immaterium in the wake of two sword-class frigates, Hammerbound and Furious Wrath. The navigators of these light vessels are highly skilled, trading current for current, skimming across the waves of the warp where their larger brethren will plow through. Skirting through all that turbulence requires an intentional focus. And so, the warp shimmer across their prow drew an immediate response. From the surface of EI Tran, the day could not have been more beautiful. But today is a special day. They delight in their warm star and the day's clear skies, for this is the source of their agricultural stability. The harvest will be brought in soon. The children are excited. There have been 2 days of fasting, and upon the morrow, with Isha's blessing, the crops will be reaped. In their vile ignorance, the Xenos do not understand what makes today special. For upon this day, the vengeance of the Emperor is upon them. Through the blue sky, back into the starry black void, the sword escorts pursue a Corsair that remains just outside of torpedo range. Of a sudden, the Corsair tacks hard toward the planet's orbit. If captained by even the meanest of deviant intellects, the Corsair will then slingshot around the planet to reorient itself, crossing the T of both frigates simultaneously and unleashing a raking broadside into the ships that cannot be answered in kind. In red-lighted bridges, servitor tacticians compute the probabilities of this as an inevitability. The skipper's response is wrought in iron and blood. Engines are pushed well beyond their safety limits. Furious Wrath's ventral heat sink fails, washing the secondary engine compartment with boiling plasma. 1,000 colliers simply evaporate. But the Hammerbound increases its speed, and as the distance between the predator and prey closes, a full spray of torpedoes launches. A junior officer, working a bronze chronograph, counts down the minutes. The bridge stinks from nervous sweat and trapped moisture. And then the clock hits 0. Silent detonations bloom in the long dark shadow of the planet. Delicate features collapse, followed shortly by secondary explosions as cascade failures take their toll. But momentum and gravity will have the final word. The Xenos hull begins to glow red-white as it first kisses the planet's atmosphere. Oxygenated air hits the stricken vessel and geysers of flame wreath the elegant ship as it plummets. And when it hits the planet's surface, a shockwave radiates outward toward the Azure Ocean, where devastating tsunamis are born. The impact trauma is immediately followed by a catastrophic firestorm that encompasses the totality of the planet's largest continent. From the pit of the impact crater, gigatons of ash and debris are thrown into the atmosphere. A nuclear winter will follow. Across a sufficiently long timeline, the widespread eradication of the planet is inevitable. But the death toll aboard the Corsair cannot be confirmed to be total. Even on a human vessel, savior pods or trauma vaults would protect some of the crew and passengers. So long as an inhuman shadow falls upon this world, the Imperium's defenders cannot slumber. So long as a single Xenos draws breath upon this world, it is done in defiance of the Emperor's will. And so, preparations are made for a ground invasion. Klaxons alarm through the ship, pulling Command Sergeant Major DuPont from his sleep, a half-burned cigarette still perched in the corner of his mouth. DuPont awakens to a splitting headache, the wounds of last night's card game still sweating out of his body. He rolls out of his rack and slaps at the chronometer sitting on the bedside table. Reeling, nearly blind, he stumbles to his cell's urinal. The senior enlisted man of the 2nd gets a few luxuries. Head splitting, liver and lungs aching, he begins to urinate. Though the chronometer lays in pieces across the floor of his cell, the alarum hasn't stopped, and Emperor's bones, but it's loud. He relights his cigarette with a pocket striker, and 2 thoughts collide at that exact moment. 1, that's not his broken chronometer alarming. 2nd, is the realization that his cell is not equipped with private hygiene facilities. Troops are roused, mustered, and quickly step into fatigues and assemble their non-destructive gear. They are routed by company and platoon to the various shipboard staging areas where naval clerks oversee the guard being issued their weapons. Shore Patrol moves about them like their jailers. This transaction transforms the men from inert cargo to something dangerous, and the naval arms men maintain a healthy distance but a wary gaze. The motor pool conducts a similar operation, though the fueling and arming procedures are overseen by tech adepts whose zeal for mechanical purity reduces the probability of a negligent discharge from a statistical improbability to a factual 0. And then it all feeds out onto the embarkation deck, where the 79th Airlift Wing waits to bring the fully assembled 2nd Regiment to the surface. The 79th had been the wings upon their shoulders for several campaigns. In addition to a single wretched heavy lander, the 79th possesses 30 Vengeance gunships, capable of deploying 3 companies. The gunships are the essence of practicality. No attention at all had been given to fine lines or aesthetic details. They were ugly things, built for a nasty task. But in their moment, hovering just so and providing cover fire for the troops belaying out, they became the most ferocious and elegant thing troops under fire might ever see. They looked like divine intervention. The gunships can't hold much more than a squad of men and their equipment. They are a crude thing, born of an older doctrine stating the Astra Militarum was a projectile to be fired by the Novus Imperialis. Beyond its vectored thrusts and admirable armor and hard points, the chief tactical advantage of this design is that the vehicles are void-hardened and capable of deploying from orbit. Through this, the regiment fulfills a literal role. The point of disembarkation is a chaotic one. For companies B through E are staged for assault, with a 5th company, A, deploying to a reserve position to help push the breakthrough. But in typical fashion, the urgency to muster the regiment is met with delays down the line, and the 2nd remains in place, the fear soaking in. The soldiers have been told nothing. But they know it's a combat op. They have to infer the rest. For the soldier, in those moments before a battle is joined, all attention narrows to a single point of focus. A soldier is a thing of many parts, and each of their needs must be met in turn. The margins for error are so thin that their preparations take on the form of ritual. In these moments, every soldier is a tech priest, inspecting their rifle for flaws. Others are numerologists, counting power packs, touching each off in turn. Others genuflect in overt acts of intense religious fervor. These are acts of ritual and faith so much farther advanced than the AdMech or the ecclesiarchy that they only belong to the soldiers of the Imperial Guard. The youngest soldiers, who do not yet have their war names scrawled into their helmet's cloth cover, must learn by watching the veterans who observed these rituals in turn or developed their own. Everything must be done just so to survive what is coming. One conscript touches each of her fingertips in turn. Sergeant Hidalgo watches his squad keenly. It gives the youngsters in his squad a bad case of the jitters. In turn, Color Sergeant Strachan reviews the company in total, a full third of which will be deploying via gunship. He wishes them the Emperor's blessing and returns to the company command squad. The company commanders have received precious little information, not much more than a series of grid coordinates. Captain Tietgen is showing 2nd Lieutenant Cole Princeton the lay of the land and pics of the wrecked hulk and the outlying terrain. A giant furrow has been plowed up across the ship's wake. It is exquisitely defensive territory. Princeton has a tab of shaving soap dried at the line of his jaw. 1st platoon will drop here and dig in like an anchor. Cole, you come up fast and hard with your platoon. Your chimeras are screening 3 battle tanks, and I want that fire support in position as quickly as possible. Strachan ventures an opinion. Sir, any estimation on what kind of resistance we are up against? Down there, visibility is going to be 0. Tietgen rolls his eyes and imperiously snaps his data slate shut. Damn the resistance. Full speed. From beside Lieutenant Princeton, 1st Sergeant Reddick cuts his eyes just so, and Strachan braces himself. He turns to meet it head-on. Sergeant Major DuPont makes a beeline to Strachan, ignoring the officers, his face a twisted pit of fury, an incomplete whiplash of violence desperate for a target. Color Sergeant Strachan, why haven't these soldiers got any goddamned grenades? Sergeant Major, Strachan tries to steer DuPont away from the officers to no avail. Naval clerks aren't releasing explosive ordnance. Well now, DuPont's face turns a deep red, a boiling fury about to be unloaded. That dog just don't hunt. Sergeant DuPont, Captain Tietgen interjects. I'm in conference with my officers. DuPont turns to the captain, collar going purple, then points to 2 idle guardsmen. You and you, come with me. Now. DuPont strikes off, Strachan and the 2 hapless troopers in tow. Out of earshot, DuPont laces into Strachan. What in the absolute hell, Ted? Strachan keeps his voice low as they shove through the hordes of soldiers. Tietgen didn't fill out the paperwork for the company to be issued grenades, Kyle. The captain. DuPont cuts him off. To hell with your excuses, DuPont growls out the words. Your job is to execute the intent of your captain's orders. You're here to mentor him. You screwed up, Ted. Off the embarkation deck, they move through passages that point to D Company's supply office. The naval clerk sees them coming and gestures slightly toward the two naval armsmen responsible for defending this point. They've got riot shotguns loaded with glass slugs. The 4 guardsmen, now armed, pose a genuine threat. Give me a company issue of frags, DuPont demands as he lights up another smoke. Pretty please. The clerk nods, apologetically, and then chokes out the words. Paperwork? DuPont leans across the clerical bench and grabs the clerk by the neck. He wrenches the sailor into the air and then slams him down on the metal bench. Bolts close around glass-packed shot, but DuPont has his lost pistol jammed into the clerk's face. Pretty please, DuPont repeats himself. The clerk is deeply moved by the sincerity visible on DuPont's face. Trembling, the clerk nods. Crates of frags are brought forward by servitor pickers, and the 2 troopers take possession of the crates. DuPont turns loose of the clerk and then strokes his cheek just so. There's a good lad. DuPont holsters his pistol and inclines his head towards the armsmen. Ladies. They return to the company quickly. DuPont pries open the crates with his knife and begins to shout out after the squad leaders. Kennedy. Fogarty. Hidalgo. Fresh milk for the baby, let's go. He grins maliciously at all of this and personally distributes the munitions, and then stands, finding Captain Tietgen waiting. The captain is nothing but an empty uniform. This is his first rodeo as a company commander. Even as a platoon officer, Tietgen's combat record had been utterly unremarkable. His rank is owed entirely to the fact that he survived where others did not. Sergeant Major, Tietgen says, and DuPont is erect and in a formal salute. Tietgen stabs a finger into DuPont's bone-colored shoulder decoration. That device is out of regulation. DuPont nods, says, sir, and then concludes his salute. Quietly, he tilts his head towards the captain's rifle, indicating the little red flashing diode on the rifle's magazine, the one indicating a discharged power pack. The soldiers and junior officers are a sea of uniform gray. Company and regimental commanders might wear a long khaki coat. Collectively, waiting for orders, they process the ritual. Some pray. They loved the emperor well enough, approximately the same as any imperial population, at least when measured by frequency. What was different was the magnitude of their devotion. A petty intervention places a bullet across a soldier's helmet instead of through it, and let the emperor be praised until the end of days. But the opposite was also true. 9 men in a squad get greased out in a single afternoon, and that 10th man would remain a bitter cynic until it was his turn to bite it. And in the second, more often than not, it was the latter that informed their faith. What they really worshipped was a command structure capable of anything other than orderly suicide. But absent that, they worshipped luck. They were freaks for luck, and the second never seemed to cultivate it just right. Troops died at a rate of 43% per engagement. For squad leaders, mortality rates dropped down to 32%. Officers, as a class measured in total from babyface lieutenants to the pig himself, died at a rate of 36% per engagement. The data set is so large that almost any conclusion can be inferred from that. But whatever the truth was, it was only going to get worse. Time after time, the regiment had been nominated for defeat by some unknown providence. In unnumbered battles across nameless campaigns, the worst misfortunes befell the regiment. Sometimes it was just rotten bad luck, but that doesn't always stick. In part, the blame fell to junior officers who could only crudely wield the regiment's doctrine and had no feel for the speed and fluidity required in an airborne assault. The officers are learning, and as they learn, the men they lead will die. And then the officers themselves die to be replaced by even greener officers. The grunts tend towards stark simplicity. Their dialect has been refined to their world, and through this mechanism, the pig was so named. Earned or not, Tyrann caught the blame for their collective misfortunes. How could they not hate him for that? But more than anything, they hated him because he was not Annika Hess. Under Colonel Annika Hess, the grunts had never complained. Hess was wholly aligned. She loved to fight, and the men loved her for her clearly defined ethos. For the veterans, their prior experiences remain locked in. An overwhelming stream of audio or visual sequences that couldn't be digested in the moment and so got socked away in such a way that it would never be digested ever. And sometimes it could be seen just playing back in a grunt's unfocused eyes. Just sitting there, aboard ship, and they'd just be gone. They're vulnerable and capable of a sensitivity that remembrancers could never capture. They're monstrous, capable of a casual viciousness without hesitation. In the Astra Militarum, there was but one way for pain to be relieved quickly. Sitting there in that miserable queue, they wait to die with forlorn detachment. They fight because they are required. It would be a shame to love life too much. 1,000 troopers could take that fact in 1,000 different directions. They got uptight about it. They stayed uptight and became freaks for the ritual. But it's empty. What purpose is hope when following Michael Terran into battle? The energy wasted there could have powered a battleship. And then everything goes silent. 10 soldiers, heads held high troop down the embarkation deck on horseback. The horses' manes are braided in complicated fractals, interwoven with flowers. At the head of this is Major Sia Pu, the regiment's first officer, and behind her, 9 AOP junior officers. They are armed with pistols, sabers, and a hunting lance burnished to a high silver. Callous men grow respectful, and even the least reverential of their number stand humbled by the inadequacy of their faith. Across that dull gray sea of armed humanity, the riders are dressed in blue. The Blues Royal are the inheritors of a grand Desarian tradition. Desarians would wear long coats in a deep azure, and when the 59th was retired, these surplus coats found utility elsewhere. They look good and catch the eye. Ultimately, that is their value. All soldiers die. Yet none will die before the Blues Royal, and this transfers the illusion of safety to everything in their wake. It might as well be a funeral procession. Simple duty is not enough for the Blues Royal. They must meet death to prove that they are brave. Their only job is to charge the enemy and make a target of themselves, catch the eye while doing it, to spare those behind for another moment. The ordinary troopers are afraid, terrified. But the noble procession of the Blues Royal shames their fear and absorbs their existential dread. The moment of silence passes like the eye of a hurricane as the cavalry unit marches into the heavy lander. Now that, a trooper remarks about the major, is a very nice thing. His mate responds in kind. A very cool one. Very dry. May the Emperor protect. Even pretty things die. At long last, all the pieces are in place, from the fleet's orbital position to the least soldier's bayonet. A dozen squads are formed up by a dozen gunships, an equal number by chimeras, and then the remainder, to be deployed as foot mobiles from the heavy lander. Only then will Lieutenant Colonel Michael Terran's riding boots touch the embarkation deck and set his spurs to spinning. Commissar de Laclos marches along at his shoulder with a gaggle of cadet commissars in tow. Terran's hair is short, with patches of premature gray at the temples. He is a tall man, spare, a body for manhandling bales of fodder. The colonel's trademark saber at his hip, peaked cap underarm, he appraises his command as he moves. He is a cavalryman, commanding an airborne assault. Absolutely marvelous, Terran shouts for all to hear. He pauses, lights a thin cigar with a brassy lighter, and moves on. Laclos points out units at random, and a cadet joins with that unit. DuPont falls in with his colonel. Terran stops before Captain White and loudly demands, "Do you want to go?" "Sir, I can't wait to go." Terran moves on, questioning officers and troopers alike. Trooper Crespin sees this and fixes the expected response in his mind as the colonel passes to their squad, addressing Sergeant Hidalgo. "Do you want to go?" Terran demands again. "Sir," Hidalgo salutes smartly. "I can't wait to go." Terran's eyes linger on the recruits far too long. Absolutely fantastic, he observes to himself, except he's spoken too loudly and moves along. Hidalgo judges this silently. When alive, Colonel Hess had not relied on such displays of enthusiasm. Respect and competence clung to her like perfume. She, and her entire command, knew what she was and what she wanted. Everything else was pageantry. Captain Tegan orders the company into position. Hidalgo ushers his squad into their assigned chimera. Within the red-illuminated vestibule, they strap themselves in. Then the engines roar to life and the chimeras board the heavy lander. The light tank shakes as maglocks clamp their tank into position, and then duller thuds as the next most is battened down. More noises reverberate as the heavy lander's ramp closes. The compressed air about his squad fills with the stink of urine. Hidalgo studies them in the gloom. Some of them are asleep, their frail endocrine systems utterly overwhelmed. And then the lander's engines engage at a deafening RPM. I heard they get into your head, the young Crespin says. Turn you into a puppet. Make you claw your eyes out, but you can't get away from what they show you. The angle of gravity changes. Fatigued metals grieve, and another trooper's bladder cuts loose. May the Emperor protect you, Hidalgo says. And the lander drops. Chapter 5. Get on the line. Sergeant Plano orders under a hail of devastating fire. Chaotic traceries illuminate the pitch-black air, impossible to differentiate between sky and ground. Their jump squad had jumped right on top of the enemy. Waltz readies his plasma gun, takes aim, and then screams as the weapon malfunctions. Waves of plasma coil around him, wreathing him. His arms burn to matchsticks of charred bone, and the fat runs off his body like candle wax. Where's our damned cover? Guardsman Anna Ivanova screams over the din. Guardsman Teresa turns to answer her, and an arcing line of heated shuriken fire slams into the trooper's head. When Teresa hits the ashen mud, her whole brain slops out of her skull's open top. Anna crawls forward 2 meters before standing tall. She's so laden with heavy mud that it's like fighting in a bad dream. And then the crest of the Xenos helm is right in front of her. Anna smashes the thing with the heavy stock of her rifle, shattering its face. The thing falls back, the face within so nearly human, the more revolting for it. She empties a burst of fire into its face and runs forward to Plano's position. Anna dives beneath a wave of fire and crawls towards a furrow where the remains of their squad maintain a base of fire. The sound of their departing gunship passes overhead, and for an instant, they are all deafened as the door gunners open up with their heavy bolters. Anna takes a snapped shot towards some vague movement to test her aim, a bad habit. The red lost bolt deflects casually off something in the gloomy offing. Corporal Stubbs pulls the pin on a frag and stands to throw it. He is immediately riddled with enemy fire. It's like he's been flensed. Clumps of flesh fall away from him, both ears, a hand, his head. A live grenade rolls from his dismembered fingertips. Plano grabs Anna by her jump harness and heaves her like a bale of straw grass before throwing himself atop her. There is no chivalry in this. His armor contains a ceramic plate, whereas her own is simple steel. Any kinetic munitions that hit her would deflect into him. The concussive shockwave of the fumbled grenade washes over them, followed by a peppering of muddy offal. Coughing up atomized mud and a fair volume of Corporal Stubbs, they pull themselves up and behind a scrap of cover just as the second gunship arrives at long last. No! Plano screams and reaches for his Vox handset. Henry, do not deploy. Do not deploy. It's too late. Silhouetted troopers jump out of the gunship with guy lines trailing. Mid-arc, the tension on the lines increases, arresting the jump troopers from terminal freefall and cushioning their landing. It's almost elegant. The gunship stalled out just so in a pirouette of conflicting forces bearing down on that hideous machine. The distant shadows of Sergeant Henry Scrabula's squad release their guy lines and are immediately shot by Xeno's fire. And then movement in the dusky offing, closing inexorably. Plano is firing first, each shot dead on, rhythmic-like. An entire magazine bounces off the Xeno's armor. Anna isn't even a full breath behind, and Plano is already ducking back into cover to change his magazine. Anna's rifle is up, her cheek welled just so, like a lover's caress. Lost bolts spray out into the night, raw enthusiasm to her sergeant's disciplined precision, equally as ineffective. The first shuriken hits her center mass, right into the steel armor plate covering her vital organs. Despite the shuriken's lightweight, the kinetic impulse is horrific. The deformed plate burns red hot, transferring enough trauma through her body to rupture organs and avulse the flesh behind the plate. Flesh boils. Ribs turn to powder. Her breasts rupture into a wet mash. The second shuriken passes through the armor as quickly as anything. She flops back into the mud like a stirred-up bucket of shit. 60 seconds. Hidalgo is no romantic. He doesn't bring a sword into combat. He takes a rifle like all the other fighting men. He looks over his squad. They have no idea what they are doing. Follow me, he says to the raw recruits. Look after each other. We protect us. Soldiers stand in a half-crouch and take their place at the lost gun array. The lander lurches, and for a moment the Chimera slides around at the violent change in pitch. The squad tumbles around. Kit entangles. The first sounds of enemy gunfire can be heard. The troopers go white, and Trooper Maria Pinero smiles nervously at Crespin, a mutual exchange. And then the low grinding as the lander's launch ramp drops open. Their inner ears, already so tumbled about, don't immediately realize their Chimera has disembarked from the lander. Only the lander's sudden wash confirms they are no longer within. "I can't see a thing." A trooper calls out and Hidalgo silences him with a hiss, and in the wake of that outburst, a smattering of low Gothic prayers. A scream across the sky, at first presumed to be a near miss except for the vast explosion that follows. No shouts at the far end of that, then the low thud of a pintle-mounted stubber opening fire. Their own. And this is the moment of transition. All the moments in time preceding this one are spent. And laid out their only purpose had been to bring them to this place. All the opportunities for turning back or bulking had been spent. And all at once, they curse their officers, their communal aldermen, and their sergeant for tricking them to bring them here. The bow-heavy bolter fires, the heavy reverberations audible through the firewall for a moment before the unmistakable sound of tearing metal silences the gun. The Chimera rocks violently and sloughs to a complete stop, knocking the squad around from the violent arrest. Dazed, they don't notice the red cabin light has turned green. Hidalgo is screaming at them, but they all hate him now, so they react so slowly. When the squad finally pounds down the dropped hatch, the thing is crushing the last of their Chimera's screaming crew within a claw. It's enormous, clouded in the dark, a statue brought to life. It moves with some insecurity until a multi-laser from a different Chimera opens up. The squad runs through a night black as the vaults of hell, interrupted only as their former Chimera is suddenly wreathed in flames. Running, Crespin steals a look over his shoulder. The second Chimera's suppressing fire is fast and ferocious. Every fourth shot hits, but most of those deflect off the machines. The statue thing heaves on a hook sword as long as a Chimera is wide and dislodges it from the first Chimera's wreckage, a final gout of flame as the emergency fuel stores go up. And in the sickly yellow cast of that fireball, he sees the thing's shoulder, and the lance mounted there begins to track them, except he knows it's not a lance as he understands it. "Cover!" Crespin screams. He grabs the nearest trooper and pulls them down. Sustained fire hits the squad. Hidalgo takes a round to the side of the head. His brains are vaporized. The rest of the squad will be shot through the neck, chest, and lungs. Limbs are lopped off with kinetic force. They don't scream out or writhe. Once hit, they drop like dead weight and collapse into the ashen mud. The lance tracks its fire to the second Chimera and then to the third. A single plasma shot answers, landing a direct hit to the thing's curved helm. Their automata doesn't even recognize the shot. It turns and sprays more fire into the dark. Somewhere, people scream run all at once. Crespin presses into his comrade as other munitions pass overhead. In another wave of flame, her name flash identifies her as Maria. He holds her hand, unable to communicate over the din of fire. He studies the dark, like some ancient astronomer looking for signs. A wave of fire opens up, angling off toward where those poor dumb jump troopers hit. He pumps her hand, a signal of purest emotional intuition. And they run, back into the dark from whence they issued. Far overhead, several hundred meters, an unfamiliar make of airframe passes. Its passing is marked by no more than the briefest of glints as its payload of drop troopers deploy by grav chute. Subscribe, like, follow,